Every year, when I read Megillat Esther, the story teaches me something new. Honestly, it's why I love learning Tanakh in general. The way this text, which has been the same for thousands of years, still seems to move with the times and reveal insights that continue to feel so relevant each time I read it. For the SAR community, this Purim is pretty much the anniversary of our COVID-19 lockdown. At this point last year, we knew very little about the coronavirus and how it spread, and how to protect ourselves and our families. It was the first time we had to rethink what Jewish communal ritual and practice should look like in the face of an unknown that was both so mysterious and dangerous. I can't help but approach this year's Purim by reflecting on all that we have been through as a school and global community over the past year. I'd like to share with you some thoughts I have about the Megillah this year as I reflect on the story through the lens of our theme of the year, Achrayut. When I read Megillat Esther, I always feel myself drawn to chapter 4, the climax, the moment when Mordechai pleads with Esther to step outside her comfortable limits and present herself before the king. What's interesting is that initially, Esther doesn't even seem to know that such a catastrophe awaits her people. She's confused when Mordechai shows up wearing sackcloth, and Mordechai actually has to show her a copy of Haman's decree to get her up to speed on the situation. Feet from the throne room, and she has no idea what's going on. Now, to Mordechai's request to approach the king, Esther famously replies, "All the king's courtiers and the people of the king's provinces know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. Only if the king extends his golden scepter to him may he live. Now I have not been summoned to visit the king for the last 30 days. Though the implication of Esther not being invited to the king for 30 days is certainly open to different readings, her response is clear. She will not approach the king without being summoned. To do so would be literal suicide. As I reread this parak, Mordechai's response to Esther jumps off the page for me in a way that it never really has before. Let's read it together. Mordechai counters Esther's concerns with two arguments, which on the surface feel very different in tone from each other. Mordechai starts, "Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place, while you and your father's house will perish." Talk about Jewish guilt. His response is sharp, and at first doesn't even seem to be rooted in fact. If Esther remains silent and continues to lay low about her identity, she will likely survive the genocide. It seems that Mordechai's hyperbole is meant to highlight the selfishness behind Esther's worries, to call her out on the fact that she is singularly concerned with her own survival and preservation. His words are sharp and meant to cut deep. Mordechai continues, "And who knows, perhaps you have attained a royal position for just such a crisis." In the past, this line always felt like an afterthought, as if Mordechai takes a step back, realizes how harsh his previous words were, and offers a more comforting, encouraging, and easy to swallow argument. He offers serendipity, that all of the events that led to Esther's current position might actually be for the purpose of her advocacy, and so they are also a harbinger of her ultimate success. Certainly, this line is the closest one gets to divine involvement in the events of the Megillah, that this comedy of errors and coincidences is being orchestrated by a master puppeteer. This year, as I reflect on the Megillah through the lens of Achrayut, Mordechai's words sound differently to me, and I am surprised to find that both approaches that Mordechai takes to convince Esther to advocate for her people, what seems like guilt and the possibility of divine providence, actually seems to fit together more organically. This year, I hear Mordechai presenting Esther with an option to look at her situation differently and to change her perspective. Until this point in the story, I imagine Esther feels like a victim of circumstance. Things happen to her, weird things, bad things. Life feels random and maybe even out of control. Esther probably feels really isolated from her people and estranged because of her bizarre situation, one that no other Jewish woman could possibly relate to. There is certainly distance, and maybe there is even resentment. All of this rings so true to me as I think about how suddenly we were thrust into a pandemic Purim this time last year. The isolation, the fear, feeling like the world was out of control, even the resentment. Mordechai's words offer Esther the possibility to shift her thinking and recognize the agency she has in her unique position. First, he shows her that though she is isolated physically from her people, and as a result may indeed survive the genocidal decree, the annihilation of the Jewish people is the destruction of her house. She is still a part of them, and as distant as she feels both physically and circumstantially, the eradication of the Jewish people will be devastating for her, because it is the eradication of herself and her family. He reminds her that despite her circumstances, she is still a part of the larger Jewish community, and urges her to see the horror awaiting the Jewish people as just as personally threatening as approaching the king without being summoned. Second, he offers Esther a new perspective on her own narrative. He asks her to recognize that she is not simply a victim of circumstance, but rather a person who has been given a voice to give voice to those who have been silenced, to see the potential for influence and change that she has been granted because she ended up as the Queen of Persia. In this reading, Mordechai's arguments boil down to asking Esther to look at her situation differently, to see herself in the suffering of her people, and to recognize the opportunity her position provides for advocacy and change. Esther's strength in this story is that she does indeed shift her thinking and adopts Mordechai's new perspective. She makes a 180 flip from victimhood and disconnect towards dignity and community. She calls her people, fasts with them, and then adorns herself with malchut, royalty, the power that she has been given to change the situation. Last Purim, we began to feel quite starkly the disconnect and isolation of lockdown and quarantine. The unknown beckoned us to retreat into ourselves and focus on the day-to-day obstacles that arose for ourselves and our households, and boy, were there many. As I look back on our journey this past year, I see the strength of Esther, heeding the messages of Mordechai. I see a community forced to lead the country in COVID conduct and lockdown procedure. A community who, despite the uncertainties surrounding even the most mundane tasks, reached out to each other and made sure that everyone had meals, school supplies, devices for Zoom, and more. A community of people who saw the suffering of others as poignantly as they saw their own suffering. And a community of people who looked around at what they had been dealt and asked themselves how they could use their advantages to ease the uncertainty and fears of others. I am personally grateful to the Schmidman family, who repurposed the food intended for their daughter's bat mitzvah in order to make sure that the SAR families in quarantine were able to have a Purim Seudah. I am pretty sure that was the first time I received a real mishloach manot the way it was intended to be. We are not at the end of this crisis, but as Purim this year ushers in memories of our early COVID days, I invite you to read the Megillah with me as a story of community coming together, taking on the challenges of the other, and rising to the occasion to assist and alleviate suffering when opportunity allows. This Purim, we can feel confident that we heard and continue to hear Mordechai's words, and in the face of a communal threat, we too adorned royalty. Chag Purim Sameach.